The day Catherine Ellis bought a house for $1, everyone laughed. 7 months later, many of those same people stood outside that very house in complete silence. A retired Marine held a worn pocket watch against his chest, tears streaming down his face. Beside him, an elderly widow trembled as she slipped a faded wedding ring back onto her finger after believing it had been lost forever. No one could explain how those treasured belongings had found their way home. Not yet. What the town didn't know was that hidden behind the walls of that forgotten farmhouse were 299 sealed envelopes, each one protecting a piece of someone's life that had disappeared years, sometimes decades, earlier. The man who had hidden them was gone. His name was Robert Caldwell, and the only reason his final act of kindness was ever discovered was because a homeless woman with just $1 left in her pocket walked into a property auction she never intended to attend. Her name was Catherine Ellis. She wasn't searching for a miracle that rainy afternoon. She was only looking for somewhere dry. Sometimes, the smallest decisions change only one life, and sometimes, they change an entire town. This is one of those stories. People often believe homelessness begins with one terrible day. It rarely does. More often, it arrives quietly, one small loss at a time. A missed paycheck, an unexpected expense, one decision made with a good heart. Until one morning, the front seat of your car becomes the only place left to sleep. That was Catherine Ellis. At 32, she had spent nearly 7 years caring for elderly residents in a small nursing home outside Fairview, Indiana. She wasn't extraordinary. She simply treated people the way she hoped someone would one day treat her. She remembered birthdays. She read newspapers aloud to veterans whose eyesight had faded. Every Friday, she brushed an elderly woman's silver hair because arthritis had stolen the woman's ability to lift her own hands. Then everything changed. A medication error was discovered during an inspection. It wasn't Catherine's mistake. But when a frightened coworker begged for help, Catherine accepted the blame, believing the truth would eventually come out. It never did. She lost her job. Her savings disappeared. A few months later, her aging blue sedan became the only place she had left to sleep. Still, every morning she folded her blanket, washed up in a gas station restroom, and searched for another job. She refused to believe kindness had been a mistake. She just wondered if kindness always came with a price. One rainy October afternoon, Catherine stepped into Fairview City Hall simply to get out of the storm. Instead, she found herself sitting in the back of the town's annual property auction. Most of the properties had already been sold. Only one remained. An old white farmhouse on Willow Street. Its porch sagged. Its windows were broken. Its paint had long since surrendered to time. The auctioneer called for $500. No bids. 100. Nothing. Someone in the crowd quietly said, "Nobody wants Robert Caldwell's place." A few people nodded. Finally, the auctioneer sighed. $1. Catherine looked through the rain-streaked window at her old sedan. The bank could repossess it any day. If that happened, she'd have nowhere left to go. She reached into her pocket. One worn dollar bill. Everything she could spare. Before fear could change her mind, she slowly raised her hand. Soft laughter filled the room. "Ma'am," the auctioneer asked gently, "are you sure?" Catherine nodded. "I'm sure." 5 minutes later, she walked back into the rain carrying the deed to a house no one else wanted. She thought she'd bought herself a place to sleep. She had no idea she had just stepped into the unfinished story of a man named Robert Caldwell, or that somewhere behind those aging walls, 299 sealed envelopes had been waiting for someone exactly like her. By the time Catherine Ellis reached Willow Street, The rain had faded into a cold mist. The farmhouse looked even worse than it had in the auction photograph. The porch leaned to one side. Several windows were shattered. Weeds had swallowed what was once a front garden, and the mailbox listed quietly, its paint almost completely gone. Catherine stood at the front door with the key resting in her hand. She wasn't looking at a dream home. She was looking at the only roof she had. After months of sleeping in her car, that was enough. The old lock resisted before finally giving way. The front door opened with a long, tired groan. Dust floated through thin beams of afternoon sunlight. White sheets covered forgotten furniture like silent ghosts. A cracked rocking chair still faced the fireplace, as though someone had stood up years ago expecting to return before supper. But they never did. The silence inside the house felt almost alive. Catherine slowly walked from room to room. The electricity had been disconnected long ago. Water stains spread across several ceilings. Kitchen cabinets hung crooked from loose hinges. The floor creaked beneath nearly every step. She let out a small laugh. "Well, I guess we've both had a rough few years." The empty house answered only with echoes. For the first time in months, she wasn't listening to passing traffic outside her car window. She was home. Or, at least, she hoped she could make it one. That evening, Catherine carried everything she owned through the front door. A blue blanket, 2 changes of clothes, a small toolbox, an old coffee pot. It wasn't much, but somehow, placing those few belongings inside the empty farmhouse made it feel a little less lonely. The next morning, she stopped by City Hall to ask what came next. The clerk recognized her immediately. "So, you've seen the house?" Catherine smiled. "I've seen worse." The woman slid a folder across the counter. "I'm afraid there's one more thing." Inside was an inspection notice. The city had already determined the house was unsafe. If Catherine couldn't repair it within 90 days, it would be condemned and demolished. 90 days. She walked outside holding the notice, staring at the old $1 receipt tucked inside her wallet. For the first time since the auction, doubt crept in. Maybe everyone had been right. Maybe she'd bought nothing more than a pile of rotten lumber. But giving up had never come naturally to her. Over the next several days, she worked from sunrise until sunset. She opened every window she could, swept away years of dust, dragged broken furniture outside, pulled waist-high weeds from the yard until her hands were blistered. Neighbors slowed their cars as they passed. Some waved politely. Others simply watched, convinced the young woman would disappear before the week was over. She didn't. Late one afternoon, Catherine began removing loose wooden panels from the kitchen wall. Most of them came away easily. Then she noticed one section sounded different. She tapped it again. Not hollow, not solid, just different. Curiosity got the better of her. Using the back of her hammer, she carefully pried away one weathered board. A cloud of dust drifted into the sunlight. She reached inside, expecting old insulation. Instead, her fingers touched paper. She pulled out a small yellow envelope. It was perfectly sealed. No stamp. No return address. Only a single name written neatly across the front. Daniel Mercer. Catherine frowned. She looked back into the narrow opening. There were more. Many more. As she widened the gap, another envelope slipped free. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, they were sliding from inside the wall onto the kitchen floor like leaves falling from an autumn tree. She froze. The envelopes kept coming. Dozens of them. Each carefully sealed. Each bearing a different name. When the last one finally settled, Silence returned. Catherine knelt on the dusty floor, her heart pounding. She counted them once, then counted again because the number seemed impossible. 299. Someone had hidden every one of them inside these walls. But why? She picked up the first envelope. For a moment, she hesitated. These belonged to someone. Opening one felt wrong. Then she noticed a small handwritten sentence beneath the name. "Please return this when the time is right." She whispered the words aloud. When the time is right. She had never met Robert Caldwell. She knew nothing about the quiet man who had once lived in this forgotten farmhouse. But sitting there, surrounded by nearly 300 sealed envelopes, Catherine felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Purpose. Taking a slow breath, she carefully broke the seal on the very first envelope. Inside rested an old silver pocket watch. Beneath it was a neatly folded handwritten letter. For a long moment, Catherine simply stared at the pocket watch resting in her hands. It was heavier than she expected. The silver case was scratched from years of use, but someone had polished it carefully before placing it inside the envelope. When she pressed the tiny latch, the cover sprang open with a soft click. The hands had stopped years ago. Inside the lid was a small engraving. "To Daniel, keep your promises and always come home. Love, Dad." Catherine swallowed. This wasn't something a stranger would throw away. Someone had loved this watch. Someone had missed it. Very carefully, she unfolded the letter tucked beneath it. The handwriting was neat, steady, almost old-fashioned. "If you are reading this, then I am probably no longer here. This watch belongs to Daniel Mercer. He never sold it because he wanted to. Life simply cornered him one day, the way life corners many good people. If you can find him, please return it. Don't ask for money. He has already paid enough. Robert Caldwell." Catherine read the letter twice, then a third time. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. She picked up another envelope. A different name, a different object. A faded wedding photograph. Another envelope held a military medal. Another contained a wedding ring wrapped carefully inside a handkerchief. Each one carried the same message. "Please return this when the time is right." Each one was signed. Robert Caldwell. Catherine looked around the empty kitchen. What were you doing? The house offered no answer. That night she barely slept. Every few hours she walked back into the kitchen, half expecting the envelopes to disappear. Instead, they remained exactly where she'd left them, lined neatly across the floor. 299 forgotten stories. The next morning she borrowed a cardboard box from a nearby grocery store and carefully stacked every envelope inside. She promised herself one thing. She wouldn't open another. The first letter had made Robert's intention clear. These weren't meant to satisfy curiosity. They were meant to find their way home. But finding Daniel Mercer in a town of nearly 20,000 people felt almost impossible. The only clue she had was his name. Still, she had nowhere else to be. She began at the public library. The librarian helped her search old telephone directories. Daniel Mercer. She checked public records. Nothing current. One elderly volunteer glanced at the name and paused. Mercer. I knew a Mercer family years ago. I think the son served overseas. It must have been 20 years back. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep looking. 3 days later, Catherine found herself standing outside a small auto repair shop on the edge of town. A faded sign read, Mercer's Auto Service. She almost laughed. Could it really be that simple? Inside, the smell of motor oil filled the air. An older mechanic looked up from beneath the hood of an old pickup truck. His gray hair peeked out from under a baseball cap stained with years of work. "Can I help you?" Catherine hesitated. "I'm looking for Daniel Mercer." The man wiped his hands on a rag. "Depends. Who's asking?" "My name is Catherine. I found something that might belong to him." The mechanic studied her for several long seconds. Then he quietly said, "I'm Daniel." Catherine reached into her bag and carefully removed the envelope. Daniel stared at his own name written across the front. The color drained from his face. His fingers trembled before he even touched it. "I haven't seen this handwriting," he whispered. "In over 20 years." Neither of them spoke while he opened the envelope. The moment he saw the watch, he stopped breathing. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped it. "No," he whispered. "No." He pressed the watch against his chest and closed his eyes. For several long moments, the repair shop became completely silent except for the ticking of an old wall clock. Finally he spoke. "My father gave me this. The day I enlisted." His voice cracked. "When my wife got sick, I couldn't pay the hospital bills. I pawned it. I told myself I'd come back the next month, but life kept getting in the way." He smiled sadly. "I drove past that pawn shop for years. I just couldn't afford to go inside." A tear rolled slowly down his cheek. I thought it had been melted down. He looked at Catherine. "Where did you find it?" She wasn't sure how to explain, so she simply answered honestly. "In a house." Daniel laughed softly through his tears. "A house?" Catherine nodded. "An old farmhouse that belonged to Robert Caldwell." The name seemed to stop him cold. His eyes widened. "You knew Robert." "I never met him." "But he left this for you." Daniel sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "I only met Robert once. It was the day I pawned the watch. He was standing behind me. I never even learned his name." Catherine frowned. "He bought it." Daniel slowly nodded. "I guess he did. He must have." Silence settled between them again. Finally, Daniel asked the question Catherine had been asking herself since opening the first envelope. Why? Why would a stranger spend his own money buying back someone else's memories, only to hide them inside the walls of his own house? Catherine looked at the envelope still resting on the workbench. "I don't know, but I think." She glanced toward the cardboard box waiting in the passenger seat of her car. "I have 298 more chances to find out." As she drove away from the repair shop that afternoon, the weight of the box somehow felt different. When she'd first discovered it, she'd believed she had stumbled upon a mystery. Now she understood. She had inherited a mission. And somewhere inside the remaining envelopes, Robert Caldwell was still waiting to tell his story. Daniel's reaction stayed with Catherine long after she drove away from the repair shop. She had expected gratitude. She hadn't expected grief. There was something unforgettable about the way he'd held that old pocket watch, not like it was made of silver, but like it carried the last piece of someone he loved. For the first time, Catherine realized Robert Caldwell hadn't been collecting old possessions. He had been protecting memories. That single thought changed everything. Until then, the envelopes had felt like a mystery. Now they felt like a responsibility. Back at the farmhouse, Catherine carried the cardboard box into the living room instead of leaving it in the kitchen. She carefully placed every envelope across the floor, arranging them by size and handwriting. Some contained thick objects. Others were almost flat. Some names were written with bold, confident strokes. Others looked shaky, as though Robert's hands had grown weaker over the years. She wondered how many evenings he had spent sitting exactly where she was now, carefully sealing each envelope, one after another, year after year, alone. She picked up another envelope but didn't open it. Instead, she turned it over in her hands. Whoever Sarah Whitmore was, Robert had believed she deserved to have something back. That was enough. The contents could wait. The following morning, Catherine drove to the local historical society. If she was going to continue Robert's work, she needed to know who he had been. The volunteer behind the front desk smiled apologetically. "I'm afraid we don't have much." She disappeared into a back room and returned with a thin folder. Inside were only a few newspaper clippings. One showed a younger Robert Caldwell standing beside a modest hardware store during a charity fundraiser nearly 25 years earlier. Another listed donations he had quietly made to the town library. No awards, no interviews, no headlines celebrating extraordinary achievements. Just small acts of kindness that most people had already forgotten. People said he kept to himself, the volunteer recalled. Lived alone after his wife passed away. Always polite. Always paid in cash. And every Thursday afternoon, he'd walk downtown carrying the same worn leather satchel. What was in it? Catherine asked. The woman smiled. No one ever knew. On her way home, Catherine stopped at the grocery store. The cashier recognized her from the auction. "So, how's the haunted house?" Several customers laughed. Catherine smiled politely. "I don't think it's haunted." "No." The cashier grinned. Then why did nobody want it? Catherine thought about Daniel, about the tears she had watched him fight, about the words Robert had written. "He has already paid enough." She simply answered. Maybe they were looking at the wrong things. The cashier looked confused. Catherine just smiled and carried her groceries outside. That evening, she sat on the farmhouse porch watching the sun disappear behind rows of maple trees. The old house creaked softly around her. For the first time since moving in, it didn't feel abandoned. It felt patient, as though it had been waiting. She remembered something one of the nursing home residents had once told her. People think losing something valuable always happens the day it disappears. The elderly woman had smiled sadly. But sometimes, you don't realize what you've lost until years later. Back then, Catherine hadn't fully understood. Now she did. Daniel hadn't cried because he recovered a watch. He cried because, for one brief moment, he held his father again. That realization forced Catherine to confront a painful truth about herself. For months, she had believed she had lost everything. Her career, her apartment, her future, her dignity. But sitting there on the old porch, she began to wonder if she had been measuring loss the wrong way. She still had compassion. She still had the ability to help someone. She still had the choice to be kind, even after kindness had cost her so much. Perhaps that was something life hadn't managed to take from her after all. The thought brought tears to her own eyes. Not tears of sadness. Something quieter. Something closer to hope. The next morning, Catherine bought a notebook at a discount store. On the first page, she wrote, "The Caldwell list." Below it, she copied every name from every envelope. 299 names. Some were local. Some she had never heard before. Beside each one, she left room for notes. Addresses. Family members. Anything that might help her find them. She wasn't thinking about how long it would take. She wasn't thinking about money. She wasn't thinking about the inspection deadline hanging over the house. She was thinking about Daniel Mercer smiling through tears as he held his father's watch. If one envelope could do that, What might the other 298 mean to the people waiting for them? Before putting the notebook away, Catherine looked once more at Robert Caldwell's careful handwriting. For weeks, she'd wondered why an ordinary man would spend years buying back strangers' treasured possessions. Now she found herself asking a different question. Not, why did Robert do it? But, why did he trust a complete stranger to finish what he had started? She looked around the quiet farmhouse. The answer wasn't hidden inside the first envelope. It wasn't hidden in the second one either. Somewhere, among the hundreds still waiting, Robert had left the reason behind it all. And Catherine was more determined than ever to find it. Catherine never intended for anyone to know what she was doing. After returning Daniel Mercer's pocket watch, she quietly drove back to the farmhouse, placed the remaining envelopes inside an old wooden cabinet, and continued repairing the house during the day. She told herself she would return another envelope whenever she had the chance. One at a time. No attention. No recognition. Just as Robert Caldwell seemed to have intended, but small towns have a way of noticing even the quietest acts. Within a week, people began talking. The woman who had bought the old Caldwell farmhouse for $1 had somehow returned something a man had lost 20 years earlier. The story passed from one front porch to another, from the barber shop to the diner, to Sunday morning church gatherings. Each person added a little more mystery. Some insisted Catherine had discovered buried treasure. Others believed Robert had left behind a hidden fortune. A few even joked that the old farmhouse had finally decided to give up its ghosts. Catherine ignored every rumor. She knew the truth was far more remarkable than any of them imagined. Several days later, she selected another envelope. The name written across the front read, Margaret Lawson. Inside was a simple gold wedding ring wrapped carefully inside a faded white handkerchief. Beneath it rested another letter. Margaret sold this ring after her husband passed away. She believed surviving was more important than remembering. Perhaps she was right. But if life ever becomes a little kinder, please give it back. Robert Caldwell. Catherine folded the letter slowly. This time, finding the owner proved easier. Margaret still lived only a few miles outside town. According to an elderly neighbor, she rarely left home anymore. The small white cottage sat at the end of a gravel road surrounded by wildflowers. When Margaret answered the door, Catherine immediately recognized the exhaustion in her eyes. Not physical exhaustion, the kind that only comes after years of loneliness. I'm sorry to bother you, Catherine said gently. My name is Catherine Ellis. I think I have something that belongs to you. Margaret looked puzzled. I don't believe we've met. We haven't. Catherine carefully held out the envelope. The older woman's eyes settled on her own name. For several seconds she didn't move. Then she whispered, I haven't seen that handwriting before. Neither had Daniel. Catherine smiled softly. I think someone wanted you to... Margaret opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The instant the wedding ring slipped into her palm, her knees nearly gave way. She covered her mouth. No, it can't be. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. My Harold. She held the ring against her heart. I sold this after his funeral. There wasn't enough money. I promised him I'd never take it off. Her voice broke. And then I broke my promise. Catherine gently shook her head. No. You kept living. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled through tears. No one's ever said it that way before. They spent nearly an hour talking over tea. Margaret told stories about Harold's terrible singing, Sunday fishing trips, and the way he always burned pancakes but insisted on making breakfast every anniversary. Before Catherine left, Margaret quietly asked, Who gave this back to me?" Catherine looked at the envelope. "A man named Robert Caldwell." Margaret frowned. "I don't remember him. I don't think you were supposed to." By the following weekend, the stories had become impossible to ignore. Daniel Mercer proudly showed his father's watch to old friends at the repair shop. Margaret Lawson wore her wedding ring to church for the first time in almost 18 years. People noticed. Questions multiplied. Who was Robert Caldwell? Why had he saved these things? How many more were there? No one knew. Not even Catherine. One afternoon, while buying paint for the farmhouse, the owner of the local hardware store stopped her before she reached the register. "I heard what you've been doing." Catherine smiled awkwardly. "I'm just returning things that belong to people." The owner nodded. "I know." He looked toward the cans of paint in her shopping cart. "Take them." She blinked. "I can't." "I insist." "It's the least I can do." Before she could answer, another customer spoke up. "I've got leftover roofing shingles. If you need them." "They're yours." A retired electrician overheard the conversation. "I can spend a Saturday fixing your wiring." Then a woman near the door added, "My husband owns a plumbing company. We'll come by next week." Catherine stood speechless. Only days earlier, many of these same people had laughed when she bought the farmhouse. Now they were offering help without expecting anything in return. Not because she had asked, because someone else's kindness had reminded them of their own. That evening, volunteers began arriving at the farmhouse. One truck became 3, then 6. Someone repaired broken porch steps. Someone replaced cracked windows. Teenagers cleared years of overgrown brush from the yard. Neighbors she had never met shared sandwiches, coffee, and homemade pie while they worked. The old house echoed with something it hadn't heard in decades: laughter. Catherine stepped onto the porch and looked across the crowded yard. Just weeks earlier, she had believed she was completely alone. Now dozens of strangers were rebuilding a home they had once ignored. She suddenly understood something Robert Caldwell must have known all along. Kindness rarely ends with the person who receives it. It quietly moves from one heart to another and another until people can no longer remember where it first began. As the sun set behind the farmhouse, Catherine looked at the cabinet inside the living room. 297 envelopes still waited. Each one carried the possibility of another reunion, another healed heart, another forgotten story finding its way home. For the first time since discovering Robert's hidden collection, Catherine realized the envelopes weren't simply changing other people's lives without realizing it. They were changing an entire town. By the beginning of November, the old farmhouse no longer looked abandoned. Fresh paint covered the weathered porch. The broken windows had been replaced. A new roof caught the afternoon sunlight where rotten shingles had once sagged toward the ground. Children rode bicycles past the house without pointing or laughing anymore. Instead, they waved. "Hi, Miss Catherine." She always waved back. Sometimes she still couldn't believe they were talking to her. Only a few weeks earlier, most of the town had seen her as the homeless woman who'd made a foolish decision. Now, they saw something entirely different. Not because she had become wealthy, not because she had done anything extraordinary, simply because she had reminded people what kindness looked like. Every Saturday morning, someone knocked on her front door. Sometimes it was a retired carpenter offering leftover lumber. Sometimes it was a church group bringing hot meals. Sometimes it was nothing more than a pie cooling on the porch with a handwritten note. "I thought you might need dinner tonight." Catherine saved every note inside a kitchen drawer. She knew what it felt like to believe no one noticed you. She never wanted to forget what these small gestures meant. The envelopes continued to find their way home. One returned a faded violin to a former music teacher who hadn't played in nearly 30 years. Another reunited a bronze star medal with a veteran who had believed it was gone forever after losing his home. A mother received the tiny pair of baby shoes she had pawned during one desperate winter to buy groceries. Every reunion looked different, but every ending felt the same. Silence, then tears, then gratitude too deep for words. Catherine never stayed long. She would quietly hand over the envelope, answer a few questions, and leave before people could thank her too much. She wasn't trying to become the story. She believed the story belonged to Robert Caldwell. She was simply helping him finish it. One afternoon, Daniel Mercer stopped by the farmhouse carrying a wooden toolbox. "I figured your front steps still squeak." Catherine laughed. "They do." For the next several hours they worked side by side, replacing old boards that had become soft with age. At one point, Daniel leaned against the porch railing and looked across the yard. "You know, I spent 20 years feeling ashamed." Catherine looked up. "Ashamed?" He nodded. "I always believed pawning my father's watch meant I'd failed him." He paused before smiling softly. But Robert must have seen something different. He saw a son trying to save his wife. "I've spent 2 decades remembering my worst decision. Now, when I look at that watch, I remember why I made it." His words settled quietly between them. Catherine realized Robert hadn't only returned possessions. He had returned people's dignity. That evening, she found herself thinking about her own life. For months, she had replayed the day she lost her nursing job. The accusation. The termination meeting. Packing her locker. Driving away with tears blurring the road ahead. She had carried that memory like a punishment. But what if she had been remembering it the wrong way? She hadn't lost her career because she was dishonest. She had lost it because she had tried to protect someone who was terrified. Perhaps it had been a mistake. Perhaps it hadn't. But kindness had been the reason. For the first time since losing everything, Catherine stopped blaming herself. She couldn't change the past. She could only decide who she wanted to become because of it. A few days later, the mayor asked if he could stop by the farmhouse. The request surprised her. When he arrived, he stood quietly on the porch, looking around at the repairs. "I owe you an apology." Catherine looked confused. "At the auction, I thought you'd lose this place within a month." He smiled sheepishly. "I was wrong." She laughed. "So did everyone else." The mayor nodded. "Maybe, but I think we were judging the wrong person." He looked toward the living room, where the wooden cabinet still held hundreds of envelopes waiting to be returned. "Us, we all thought Robert Caldwell died alone. It turns out he left behind one of the greatest gifts this town has ever received." He paused before adding, "And somehow, he trusted exactly the right person to carry it forward." Those words stayed with Catherine long after he left. Exactly the right person. No one had ever described her that way before. Not since she lost her job. Not since she lost her apartment. Not since she started sleeping inside her car. For months, she had seen herself as someone life had forgotten. Now she wondered if life had simply been preparing her for something she never could have imagined. That night, she unlocked the wooden cabinet once again. The remaining envelopes were stacked neatly inside. She counted them. 273. 26 had already found their way home. She smiled. It wasn't a large number compared to the hundreds still waiting. But 26 families were sleeping a little lighter because of Robert Caldwell. And because he had trusted a stranger. Catherine carefully placed her notebook beside the box. On the next empty page, she wrote a single sentence. Kindness doesn't disappear when someone dies. She stared at the words for a long moment before closing the notebook. Outside, the farmhouse stood brighter than it had in decades. Inside, hundreds of stories still waited patiently behind sealed envelopes. Catherine knew the hardest part of Robert's mission was still ahead, because among the names she had yet to return was one envelope that Robert had never intended for anyone else to open. One envelope, with Catherine's future hidden inside it. Winter arrived quietly in Fairview. The first snow settled across the roof of the old farmhouse, covering the fresh repairs and making the house look peaceful for the first time in years. Inside, the fire crackled gently as Catherine crossed another name off the Caldwell list. 38 envelopes had now been returned. 38 families had reclaimed something they believed was gone forever. Sometimes it was a wedding ring, sometimes a photograph, sometimes nothing more valuable than an old recipe book filled with a mother's handwriting. But Catherine had learned something Robert Caldwell understood long before anyone else. The value of an object is never measured by what someone will pay for it. It's measured by the memories no amount of money can replace. One snowy afternoon, Catherine decided it was finally time to organize the few envelopes that remained unopened. She carried every box into the living room and spread them across the floor. Most followed the same pattern. A name. A carefully sealed envelope. Robert's familiar handwriting. But one envelope immediately caught her attention. Unlike all the others, it had no name. Only 2 simple words written across the front. For Catherine. She froze. Her heart began to race. That couldn't be possible. Robert Caldwell had died before she'd ever bought the farmhouse. He couldn't have known who she was. Yet there it was, written in the same careful blue ink she had seen hundreds of times before. For Catherine. For several minutes, she simply stared at it. Had someone else written it? No. She knew Robert's handwriting too well now. Slowly, almost afraid to breathe, she broke the seal. Inside was a single folded letter. Nothing else. She unfolded it carefully. Dear Catherine, if this letter has reached your hands, then my little plan worked far better than I ever dared to imagine. No, I didn't know your name. I simply trusted that the right person would someday walk through this front door. If your name isn't Catherine, then perhaps you're reading someone else's letter, but somehow I don't think that's what happened. Catherine frowned. A small smile appeared despite herself. Robert had been joking. Even in a farewell letter. She continued reading. Many years ago, I watched a young father sell his late father's watch because his wife needed medicine. The pawn shop owner called him irresponsible. I saw something different. I saw love. That day I bought the watch after he left. Not because I needed another watch, but because I hoped one day life might become kinder to him. Then another person came through that same pawn shop. And another. Soon I realized something heartbreaking. Most people weren't selling memories because they didn't care about them. They were selling them because they believed the people they loved mattered more than the things they owned. I couldn't save everyone, but perhaps I could save one memory at a time. Catherine felt tears gathering in her eyes. For weeks, she had wondered why Robert had spent years collecting strangers' belongings. Now she finally understood. He had never been collecting objects. He had been collecting second chances. The letter continued. If you're reading this, then I was right about one thing. Kindness survives longer than the people who create it. I always knew I would run out of time before I returned everything myself. That's why I hid the envelopes here. Not because I wanted a mystery, but because I believed kindness always finds another pair of hands willing to carry it. Catherine had to stop reading. She wiped away tears with the back of her sleeve. For the first time since entering the farmhouse, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt as though Robert himself was sitting quietly across the room. She looked around the old house. The repaired windows, the polished floors, the fire warming the living room. Weeks earlier, she believed she had rescued the farmhouse. Now, she realized something astonishing. The farmhouse had rescued her. She returned to the letter. The final page contained only a few short paragraphs. You may wonder why I trusted a stranger. The answer is simple. Every act of kindness I've ever witnessed was first performed by strangers. Friends are people we already know. Neighbors are strangers we decided to love. If this town has become a little kinder because of these envelopes, then promise me one thing. When the last envelope is returned, don't let the kindness end with you. Someone else will need hope someday. Leave them something worth finding. Robert Caldwell. Catherine lowered the letter onto her lap. The room was completely silent except for the fire. She understood now that Robert hadn't left her an inheritance. He had left her a calling. The envelopes had never been the true gift. The gift was the reminder that ordinary people possess an extraordinary ability to change lives without expecting anything in return. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside its envelope. Not to hide it. To protect it. Just as Robert had protected hundreds of other precious things. The next morning, Catherine asked Daniel Mercer, Margaret Lawson, and several of the families she'd met over the past months to gather at the farmhouse. No speeches had been planned. No reporters had been invited. As everyone stood together in the snow-covered yard, Catherine stepped onto the porch holding Robert's letter. She read it aloud from beginning to end. By the time she finished, almost everyone was crying. No one spoke for several moments. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. We've spent months thanking Robert. He looked around at the people standing beside him. Maybe the best way to thank him is to become a little more like him. Heads nodded throughout the crowd. In that quiet moment, something invisible passed from one person to another. Not money, not possessions. A promise. A promise that Robert Caldwell's final act of kindness would not end with the last envelope. It would become part of the town itself, and although Catherine didn't know it yet, that promise was about to spread far beyond the borders of Fairview. Spring returned to Fairview almost a year after Catherine Ellis had walked into the property auction with a single dollar in her pocket. The farmhouse no longer looked forgotten. The porch was filled with rocking chairs donated by neighbors. Flowers bloomed where weeds had once grown waist-high. Children often stopped by after school, not because they needed anything, but because they knew Miss Catherine would always have lemonade and time to listen. It had become more than a house. It had become a place where hope seemed to feel at home. Inside, only one envelope remained. The wooden cabinet that had once held 299 carefully sealed stories now stood nearly empty. Catherine lifted the final envelope with both hands. She had delayed this moment for weeks. Not because she was afraid, because she knew that once the last envelope was returned, Robert Caldwell's extraordinary mission would officially come to an end. The final envelope belonged to an elderly woman named Eleanor Brooks. She lived nearly 2 hours away in a small assisted living community. Inside the envelope was nothing expensive. Only a faded recipe book held together with string. The pages were stained with flour, butter, and decades of family dinners. Robert's note read, "Some recipes feed a family. Others keep a family together. Please return this to Eleanor Brooks. Her grandchildren deserve to taste these memories." Catherine smiled through tears. She made the drive the very next morning. When Eleanor saw the worn recipe book, she reached out with trembling hands. "I thought this was gone forever." She carefully turned the brittle pages. Every recipe carried handwritten notes in the margins. Too much cinnamon. James always asked for seconds. Made this the day our youngest was born. Eleanor laughed and cried at the same time. My grandchildren always ask how I made my apple pie. I kept telling them I couldn't remember. She held the recipe book against her chest. Now they'll know. Catherine hugged her before quietly leaving. No photographs. No celebration. Just another family receiving something that had never truly belonged to the past. Driving back toward Fairview, Catherine realized something surprising. She wasn't sad that the last envelope was gone. She felt peaceful. Robert's promise had been fulfilled. Every memory had found its way home. But when she pulled into the farmhouse driveway, another surprise was waiting. Dozens of cars lined the road. The front yard was filled with familiar faces. Daniel Mercer, Margaret Lawson, the mayor, the librarian, the carpenter, the church volunteers, families whose lives had been touched by Robert's kindness. Catherine stepped out of her car, completely confused. "What's going on?" Daniel smiled. "You finished Robert's mission, so today, we're beginning yours." The crowd stepped aside. In the middle of the yard stood a beautiful wooden sign. Burned into the oak were the words, "The Robert Caldwell House of Kindness." Below them, in smaller letters, "Where every act of kindness begins another." Catherine covered her mouth. "You didn't." "Oh, we did," Margaret laughed. "The town voted. The house belongs to everyone now." The mayor stepped forward. "We've created a community trust. This home will always belong to the people who need it most." He handed Catherine a folder. "We'd like you to stay as director, not because you found the envelopes, but because you taught us what to do after they were gone." Catherine couldn't speak. Only a year earlier, she had believed she had nothing left to offer the world. Now an entire town believed otherwise. The years that followed changed Fairview in ways no one could have predicted. The House of Kindness became a place where struggling families found temporary shelter. Retired teachers tutored children there after school. Mechanics repaired cars for widows who couldn't afford the bills. Local farmers donated fresh vegetables every weekend. Doctors volunteered one evening each month. Teenagers spent Saturdays helping elderly neighbors repair fences, paint porches, or simply share a meal. No one kept score. No one expected recognition. People simply asked one question: what would Robert have done? And then, they did it. One quiet evening, several years later, Catherine walked onto the familiar front porch carrying a small wooden box. Inside wasn't jewelry, or money, or anything valuable, only dozens of handwritten letters. Each letter told the story of someone in Fairview whose life had been changed by an unexpected act of kindness. Some writers had once received help. Others had become the ones giving it. Catherine smiled as she placed the box inside the wall during a renovation. Then she attached a small note. "If you find these someday, please don't remember us for what we owned. Remember us for what we gave away." She gently closed the wall. Just as Robert Caldwell once had, people often believe miracles arrive with flashing lights and impossible events. But most miracles are much quieter. A stranger choosing compassion over judgment. A helping hand offered without expecting repayment. A single act of kindness that refuses to end with the person who started it. Catherine Ellis never became rich. She never became famous. But because she walked into a property auction with $1 and an open heart, hundreds of families recovered more than lost possessions. They recovered pieces of themselves. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy anyone can leave behind. Because homes eventually grow old. Money eventually disappears. Even names fade with time. But kindness, when placed into the hands of another person, can outlive us all. When Catherine Ellis bought that old farmhouse for $1, she believed she had lost everything. What she didn't know was that her greatest purpose was waiting behind its walls. Robert Caldwell never expected recognition. He simply believed that no one should lose a precious memory because life had become difficult. And through one ordinary act of kindness, he continued changing lives long after he was gone. Perhaps that's the lesson this story leaves with us. We may never return 299 forgotten treasures, but every one of us has the power to give something just as valuable: a phone call, a kind word, a second chance, or simply our time. Those small moments often become the memories people carry for the rest of their lives. So before you leave today, ask yourself one question. What is one act of kindness you hope someone will remember you for? Share your answer in the comments. We'd truly love to read it. If Robert and Catherine's journey touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share this story with someone who could use a little hope today. Because in the end, people may forget what we owned, but they will never forget how we made them feel.